Good evening. How are you all tonight? Good. Excellent. Well, welcome to tonight's presentation, Interculturality, Living in a Diverse Community, Preferential Option for the Other, with Father Juan Molina. Yay. My name is Danelle Poling, and I am the Director of Conversatio, Creating a Culture of Encounter, an initiative in collaboration with the Mexican American Catholic College and the Lilly Foundation. In the winter of 2021, a small working group came together to listen, create, and dream about how to best prepare and support pastoral leaders for parish and diocesan ministry. After 70 interviews with pastors, parish leaders, parishioners, and bishops, we identified the complex challenges and opportunities, both cultural and ecclesial, facing rural and small-town Catholic parishes. We listened to the needs of prospective students regarding access to graduate theological studies, and considered how we, as the School of Theology and Seminary community, could strengthen and sustain our already robust and effective degree and ministerial formation opportunities. Thus, our program was created and helped realized through the generosity and commitment from the Lilly Endowment. Our work is grounded in the Benedictine practice of Conversatio Morum, which calls all Christians to a lifelong conversion and growth by the Spirit. Second, we heed Pope Francis's call for the Church to foster a culture of encounter, a way the Church can witness to a broken world, forming and transforming through relationships, outreach, listening, and practicing cultural humility. An essential part of our work is that we are not doing this alone. And so we are partnering with MAC, Mexican American Catholic College in San Antonio, Texas. Our collaboration is in the classroom, in dialogue and research, in immersive experiences that help us learn about each other and our communities, and in educational exchanges such as this one tonight. This is our third exchange, I'm happy to say. Dr. John Chidakuri came last fall and shared with us intercultural communication. Dr. Kristen Kohlberg, who's with us tonight, traveled down to MAC in March and shared synodality and the listening church with that community. So thank you for coming and being a part of our ongoing discussions and learning and our commitment to interculturality and ministerial formation, and most importantly, our relationship building with MAC and Father Juan. I'd like to invite Dr. Sean Kohlberg, our Dean of the School of Theology, to introduce Father Juan tonight.
Thank you, Danelle. And thanks for all the work that Danelle and her team has done to make this event a welcoming and lively one. We're really grateful, Danelle. These things don't happen by accident or out of the ether. And thanks to all of you who have joined us for this wonderful evening focused on the theological and pastoral implications for living in diverse communities. My name is Sean, as Danelle said, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the School of Theology. Tonight's event is part of the School of Theology and Seminary's Conversatio, Creating a Culture of Encounter program underwritten by the Lilly Endowment. Our Conversatio program is grounded on the Benedictine principle and vow that we are called to a daily conversion of life. A gradated, regular, and steadily transformative movement into deeper relationship with God and others. For many of us, this happens in and through our vocations to ministry. And our Conversatio program here at the SOT aims to form ministers who are both rooted and stable in our shared Catholic faith, as well as agile and responsive to the needs of our time. And we're living in times of great need. Need for people on fire for ministry, need for people to share the good news of the gospel, and need for people who are humble, flexible, and ready to encounter others in diverse communities. Because first and foremost, this is the reality of the Christian church into which you and I are living. It's also the reality of our student community here. And second of all, it's the gospel imperative. Jesus ministered and worked in a culturally diverse setting, and he sends his disciples out to do the same. As part of that, we are called to a lifestyle of conversatio. And it's with that in my heart that I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speaker and our colleague, Reverend Dr. Juan Molina. Father Juan is president of the Mexican American College in San Antonio, Texas, with whom the SOT has this wonderful collaborative relationship through 2 multi-million-dollar grants with the Lilly Foundation, Lilly Endowment. Father Juan oversees the mission and identity of MAC, a pioneer in bilingual higher education, with an emphasis in pastoral ministry that welcomes a diverse group of students. It really is the forerunner of so much of what we're trying to do here in the United States that's aimed at a welcoming church that understands encounter with the other. Father Juan comes to his role with a multitude of gifts. Besides serving in parish ministry, including in Victoria and San Antonio, Father Juan served as director of the collection for the church in Latin America and as foreign policy advisor for Latin America and global trade in the Office of International Justice and Peace, both at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Father Juan also previously worked in leadership for Catholic Relief Services. Father Molina holds a Master's of Arts in Spirituality and a Master's of Divinity from the Washington Theological Union in Washington, D.C., a Master's of Arts in International Political Economy and Development, and a PhD in Economics, both from Fordham University. Father Juan has published several works, both in economics and spirituality, including the book, The Impact of Remittances in Developing Countries, Saving, Investment, and I like this part, School Enrollment. Okay. He has a warm and wonderful personality, welcoming others into the work of ministry and a commitment to building up the people of God. We are so pleased to welcome Father Juan to St. John's University and the School of Theology and Seminary. Thank you, Father Juan, for sharing your gifts with us and continuing this dynamic relationship between the School of Theology and MAC. Please, mucho gusto and bienvenidos. Please join me, amigos, in welcoming our friend and fellow maestro, Father Juan Molina.
Is that me? Thank you so much for that introduction, and I must tell you, I feel so truly blessed to be here, not only personally, but also for both institutions, because this is off track in a way, but the invitation to join St. John's in this partnership came right as I was leaving for Mass on Holy Thursday. And I said, I'll respond to this later. And I think that's what I responded to Jeff. I said, I'll read it and consider it, and I'll let you know. So from the beginning, I have seen that this is a sign from God. There's almost no doubt in my mind about that. And as we begin to see the fruits of this relationship, that doubt obviously becomes less and less and less, if it ever was there, in many ways. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the welcome. And thank you, all of you, for trying to continue to be the body of Christ in the world and continuing to understand one another and to try to understand one another in many ways. Tonight I want to talk about a few things, but my presentation is mainly divided into 3 moments, and you're going to see that because we're going to have some discussions at the table as well. So that will be, I think, a very engaging way of bringing not only to mind whatever you might have, but also to express it and to discuss it with others. So we're going to do a little bit of what I called, I'm not here to tell you how-tos, but rather to give you some vision, maybe, some models of how things could happen. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some aspects of intercultural living that might be important. And then we'll get a little bit more into some details about how to do that, especially 7 characteristics of what I call intercultural living. And why the title of the talk? It seems like a lot, but it's all together in a way. It's very connected. One, you want to look at the features of intercultural living, especially for us faith-based people. So you want to make sure that you know how to live, not only living, but also ministering, because those two things are different in many ways, in more ways than one. And then what I picked up from Father Anthony Giddens, this preferential option for the other, which obviously being Latin American, for me, the preferential option for the poor has a lot to say, right? And bringing it into other settings makes a lot of sense. So the first thing is that as you look at the church today, and as it continues to develop, as it continues to emerge, what do you see? You see a very diverse church, no matter what. The train has left the station. The boat is already sailing in a way. But you see many ethnic groups with different needs and challenges. And even though there were models in the past of how to take care of those things, nowadays we seem to be without the tools, or maybe the right tools, to do pastoral care, to do ministry, even to do living together. It's not that we are failing, but it's more that we need more in some ways. You also see that Hispanics are an increase in minority, but the truth is that they're not the only minority that is increasing. Part of it depends on the region of the country, and part of it depends on your own relationships in some ways. All of those things also impact on your ministry and the way that you would live in community as well. And for me, the biggest thing is that the church has a role to play in society, especially in terms of morality and in terms of intercultural living. And so what do we want to do? We want to, in a way, use the model that most of us are familiar with, theological reflection, to help us do a few things. We want to, first of all, that old thing that Benedictines do, right? Attend by listening to our conversation partners, that conversatio that we're doing, our experience, our Christian tradition, and our culture. At MAC, obviously, our role is to emphasize language and culture as a way of doing faith as well. We also want to ask critical questions. Most of all, we want to suspend judgment and explore possibilities. As we explore those possibilities, you suspend judgment because, in a way, you want to give yourself the freedom to see how the world could be, how you could be in some ways, if you were allowed to. We want to also, in some ways, assert ourselves and our experience by sharing our perspectives in a dialogue in which we can clarify and share our convictions, maybe affirm one another, but also sometimes challenge one another. We have to let ourselves be challenged. We have to let our horizon be expanded. That's the whole point. I've seen it even with our relationship with St. John's. It's just been expanded, not because of course offerings, but because of the perspectives that we all bring to the table. We talk about the same thing, and we end up with realizing that, oh, gee, I hadn't thought about that, and about that, and about that, and about that. And in that way, I think our religious insight also gets enriched. But we also want to respond. I like one thing that Father Francisco put in my room as the guest master. There is a Bible there in Spanish, and it's the usual ora et labora. But there is also reflect, pray, right? Ora, labora. But labora is put into action. Do something about it. And that, I think, is important because we want to not only discern how we're going to respond, but we also want to revise and adjust both our living and our pastoral plans. So at MAC, we use some very specific ways or some basic things to do theological and spiritual reflection on not only our identity, but also our own experience. And the whole thing, in a way, I summarize it as we want to go from the point of seeing the other as other to union or equality. That is a radical inclusion of the other. And I came upon that term as well, that radical inclusion, in New York City, where there was a Protestant reverend who, in her church, that's what she would do. You want to include, but radically, you want to include the other. We also can use, obviously, theology and the language of encounter that has been popularized by Pope Francis. Here, obviously, we have more bibliography in Spanish, but not so much anymore, because so much has been also written in English by now. I also have to give you a caution, and I've done that to several groups, because nowadays, as we look at the Western world in a way, we think, and especially vocations, and vocations to the ministry as well, especially ordained vocations to the ministry, we always think of decline. But maybe we also need to think about it in a different way. We also need to think about it of not relativizing, but putting into perspective where Christianity is in the world in some ways, and where ministry comes into place as well. I think that's important for all of us to do. So as I said before, I just want to give you some suggestions and models more than how-tos. How-tos are for technical things, And a lot of the time, that's what people want when you attend a conference or a talk. You just want to learn something very concrete in some ways. So you always want to give something of that, so that people don't say, oh, I'm so discouraged or I'm so disappointed. But at the end of the day, you also want to invite people into some type of discernment, reflection, thinking about this. So I'm sure that some of you already have seen these books, Building Intercultural Competence for Ministers. That came along around the same time as this other book, Best Practices for Shared Parishes, was also published. And by the way, the other book, Living Mission Interculturally, we ended up translating it at MAC, and a lot of what I'm telling you tonight comes from that as well, and from my own reflection. And sometimes, you know how it is, some books just tell you, just give you that experience of, aha, that's what I was experiencing, and I couldn't really put into words. To me, that's what that book did in the last 2 or 3 years or so. Lately, there has been another book also that has given me those aha experiences. So when you look at models for living in ministry, maybe I will just go like this if you can still hear me. Historically, you can move from left to right to look at least 3 of the ones that I put here. But most of us were living before our globalized world, in a world where every continent was its own, and very few people traveled to them. Then, especially for Christianity, this has been the major model of evangelization. Evangelizers from one continent come to the other, and they basically give you everything, right? In theology, we're talking so much about the fact that that model doesn't work anymore, or as much. And then we got to a point, I think in the late 70s or so, where at least there was a recognition that almost every other continent, every other culture, every other language group had something to contribute, but we were still like separate. We might be more aware of each other, things like that, but there wasn't really that connection. Then we were thrown into what I call this salad bowl. Remember, in society we've talked about these things as well. Nobody wants to talk about the melting pot anymore. You want to talk about the salad bowl, because everybody brings their own richness into it, right? And if you put a salad dressing, maybe that's what connects us all. And so what you have is people becoming much more familiar, interacting with one another, all of those things. But at the end of the day, I think that salad bowl model also has some deficiencies or some limitations. Intercultural living really is focused more on ministry and community, not just what I say here, transactions, interactions with one another. You are from your own ethnicity, your own cultural group, from your own language group, and I'm in my own, and we just exchange something, and that's it. We can use that model, but maybe it doesn't really bring all of the flavors in that salad bowl, in a sense. So the axis here is balanced on or because of the interrelationships among the members. I think our faith calls us to much more than just having transactions and then just being aware of one another. It calls us into this truly intercultural model in which there is almost a porousness to the boundaries. And eventually, you may be in two worlds, not just one, in two cultures, or you might be bilingual, or your family might be. In the globalized world, we're seeing that we have many more people who fit this model. And eventually, there might be some of us who are in so many worlds in a way. We say that we live in a world of our own, right? Mm-hmm. But we also know that there is something new that emerges once you begin to see that you can not only be bilingual or bicultural, but you begin to put yourself in the shoes of the other. And you begin to see how those people really feel. And you can name some of those things as well. So I'm not going to tell you that. We can do that as one of the table discussions. But this is what faith-based intercultural living does, where some people are members of one or several groups. They belong to those groups, and the belonging sometimes is somewhat ambiguous. I mean, that's what millennials do sometimes, right? It's a difficult relationship. It's a shady relationship in a way. I'm using that word in a good way. Even employment can be that way nowadays. Well, that's not what it is. If you talk to human resources people, they'll tell you that. It's so complicated nowadays to get a commitment from somebody because we're fluid. Well, maybe I go here, maybe I go there, maybe I do this, maybe I do that. That's kind of normal nowadays in a sense. And for some of us, that's how membership in some groups can be. That's why parish registrations have gone down so much. Because you might be registered in a parish, but you have another community that really feeds you spiritually and personally, things like that. And so the balance is not obtained by having only transactions, but it's rather obtained by having a common faith and a common purpose, and through encountering one another. It's not just a cultural identity. It's more than that. It's being into all of yourself, going into all of yourself. And here the point is that everyone gains from the richness of the members, of each one of them, and gives meaning to the other. You might want to pause for a while to see that. Your interaction with someone else gives you some meaning as well. And you're not only giving somebody else some meaning, there is some mutuality there. So, as I was telling you from this reverend in New York City, the way that I kind of came up with it from this one book is you're going from the old melting pot to just creating a very new, different community. We're creating a different parish. We were talking about that last night, and even this morning, when people talk about having a parish where there is a Mass in Spanish or Vietnamese or anything else, and a Mass in English. But the reality is, and I've seen it with my brother priest, is that sometimes that's the model where people tell you, as a vicar, for example, a parochial vicar, you're the Spanish-speaking parochial vicar. And then they make you the pastor, and in that parish, there are 4 different languages in 4 different communities, but you've been formed only in one. How are you going to take care of all the other ones? And how are you going to be their leader? There needs to be a different sense. I'm not going to go through all of that because you can watch the recording and we can talk even more. But the point here is that as we encounter one another and get to know one another better, we are both being enriched. It's not just that we are welcoming immigrants, for example, but it's also that we're not only enriching immigrants, immigrants are enriching us. Because at the end of the day, we need to recognize that we all have something in common, but there is also some difference to ourselves. And the major call of the church is to see how we can create community, how we can be in communion with one another and really be the body of Christ. So let me pause here and have you discuss for about 5 minutes in your tables, just these questions that may have come up. You may have others from what I have mentioned so far. Are you relating or thinking of groups or persons in your family, in your community, in church? What about your ministries? Do you see this happening in organizations other than the church? Obviously, we're centered on the church in some ways, but do you see it in other businesses, in other communities? And are there any particular events that come to mind? For religious, for example, you could discuss for a whole hour, you could talk about this. And when you talk, for example, about the German Benedictines as opposed to the Italian Benedictines or the Spanish Benedictines, all of that, right? In German Benedict, of course, or the Swiss, same thing. Or you can talk about the other continents as well. And it's almost the same thing in some ways, where there are some common kind of traits and characteristics and reactions to these things. Anyway, let's talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll continue on. Okay, this is, I'm sure, only a teaser in a way. And at the end, we'll have questions and answers and comments. I'm sure that you all have been discussing wonderful things, and it looks like everybody had a very lively discussion. Hopefully, this is only the beginning of that. Now I want to shift a little bit from going to, from discussing models to more discussing some features of intercultural living, some things that may be challenging as well with intercultural living. First of all, intercultural living, for it to be fulfilling, it seems to me that it needs to be intentional and faith-based. It's not just because of business that you're doing that. That would be multiculturalism, or the way society looks at it. For us, if we want to do intercultural living and even ministry, which already has as a basis faith, it has to be faith-based. So it's different from simply being a member of a multicultural community. You can do that in New York City. I lived there, obviously, for several years, and you could walk for like 10 blocks and literally have a trip around the world. And you could, every night, you could eat something different. That opens you up to maybe something more divine in a way. Intercultural living also is not about just living under one roof with people of diverse cultures. You'll see why in a moment I'm saying that. And it's also not about living in the same neighborhood with people from other countries. Because as I showed you in the models, that very well can happen. But is it enriching? Is it enriching not only of the families or the neighborhood, but of everyone in the neighborhood? So the other aspect, and why I'm saying that intercultural living in ministry has to be faith-based, is because faith can only be lived culturally. That's been a realization in the past few years in theology as well. Because at the end of the day, every person is marked by cultural traits. Faith comes to us as a person, but we already live in a particular culture. That is, there is no lived faith without a corresponding lived culture. We can ask ourselves why. Faith is expressed in practice at the end of the day. And so faith ends up being expressed through one's culture. We'd stop here and just unpack this, right? In so many different ways. The issue is that when faith is not rooted in one's culture, it may lead to religious or spiritual schizophrenia. In religious life, that can happen. In the parish, that can happen as well. Very much. Just to give you an example that I think most of us can identify it with, are the Marian devotions. To pray to Our Lady of Czestochowa is not the same as praying to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and it's not the same as praying to Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception or any other Mary there is, right? It's the same Mary at the end of the day. But we express it in our own way. I've realized that more and more nowadays, for example, because in San Antonio at the seminary, we have several Vietnamese seminarians. Our Lady of Lavang. I know nothing about Our Lady of Lavang. So I need to learn more about that, to see how they express their faith. Because even when you might be praying the rosary, they're the same words, right? One Our Father, 10 Hail Marys, one Glory Be. You might actually be having Mary in your mind in a completely different image. Another aspect is that intercultural living in ministry is not a problem. I think as I was trying to also tell you about our own understanding of supposedly the decline of Christianity and religious vocations or vocations to the ministry, it's only a reframing that we have to do in some ways. And the same thing with intercultural living. It's a challenge to be faced with, of course, but it has to be dealt with. And it's a challenge that faces everyone. Overall, I think it demands that we avoid the us and them syndrome. They are the newcomers in the parish. They are the new students. All of those things. They are whoever, other, they, and we are us. And us, throughout the years, has changed at the end of the day. That's the irony of it all. Intercultural living also can be achieved by communities that strive to become we. Everyone is us, radically included. That's why it took some time to create those diagrams, for example, so you could see the porous boundaries, the biculturality at times, the belonging to several groups, all of those things. And eventually, you end up being changed. And you end up changing others. However, the truth also is that for some, interculturality is not desirable. They may not have the skills for it or the attitude for it. And it may also be at times unnecessary. So, when it's unnatural, it's also possible that if you really want to and need to, then you can look at the supernatural aspect or the supernatural motive of it. And as I keep insisting to you, interculturality is not about mastering techniques only. You know how it is sometimes? Even one of my first courses in theology was counseling principles, right? For pastoral ministers. the listening part. And they give you some techniques, which is good. Interculturality is not about only techniques. It's about, more than anything, an attitude and a desire to get to know the other and let the other know you. So that's why it calls for a radical reorientation in the manner in which we interact with one another. The reality, too, is that interculturality is not easy, since it is not for everyone. It focuses us on God at the end of the day. That's a truth that has to be expressed in more ways than one. It's not good for one culture to dominate others in community when it comes to living interculturally. You minister from your own culture, yes, but it's not the prevailing culture in a way. Nor do you have to tell people how to do those things. And you can come to realize this in many, many ways. At one point, I was in a conference one time, and I was making the point that in most of the world, if not only in the United States, registration in a parish is required. It's the only place where, maybe in others, in Europe, for tax reasons, for example, but for the most part, in most parishes around the world, registration is not required. That's kind of a culture, a cultural attitude that you have to be registered. Cultural domination here, the point is that it causes distress and alienation. And here, almost every minoritized group can give you an example of how they have been alienated or distressed. Even from the famous registration aspect that I was telling you, to requiring baptismal talks or anything else. Some of those things are necessary. I remember one time someone calling me and crying that the parish secretary had said, "Mom, if you don't register in the church, when you're dying in the hospital, the priest is not going to visit you." Talk about distress and talk about alienation. But at the end of the day, this aspect of cultural domination, it's also that it stifles creativity, because we think we can only do things in one way, and not in different ways. Interculturality also requires goodwill, but goodwill is not sufficient. There has to be some accountability as well, and some vision. So let's look at some of those things. Goodwill is important, but not enough. Real commitment to an attitude of getting to know the other is needed. Action is always needed as well. And a sustained hard work to acquire skills and virtue. And here the virtue is appreciation for the other. Is always required. We always kind of tend to stay with one another, with people who are similar to us. And interculturality is about recognizing that, first of all, that's just a natural thing, but also recognizing that you can be with someone else who is different, and it will not pose a threat to your identity. In fact, it may enrich you. As you learn about them, you may learn some things about themselves and about other ways in which you can actually interact with other people. So that's why I think also interculturality demands graciousness. And for a parish, for a congregation, for a group of people that want to have a common purpose, it requires a vision. You know how we always talk about theological reflection, or sometimes, at least in Latin America, the very basic kind of theological reflection is the see, judge, and act. And you see some things, you see how God wants that, so you judge between what you see in reality, in your experience, and what God wants, especially from scriptures and tradition, and then you act on that. Here, the point is that as you do those things, you begin to put on the vision of God. That same idea, no? Of seeing what God would see. And seeing in a way what may happen not now, and especially not what happened in the past, although that's informative, but what can happen in the future. And that's important. So this work is not easy in some ways. It requires diplomacy. It requires a lot of compromising a lot of the time. It may require that one time you stay quiet to allow the other to express themselves. I was hearing about a talk last week by another a priest, and that seemed to be challenging for some people. That's the aspect of diplomacy. How much do you let someone express their own feelings and attitudes, and how much do you sit with that? You know, in that tradition of discernment. It requires mutual respect. That's probably one of the most important things. It requires serious dialogue. That is, let's not just agree to disagree. That's one thing. Sometimes you have to do that. But a lot of the time it's also about, let's see what points we disagree on, but what points we also agree on. How can we move together? In the parish, sometimes you have to do that. In religious life, you do that all the time when you're doing a good discernment as well. And you require a vision, this vision of God, in the see, judge, and act, or any other kind of theological reflection. It requires a vision that inspires the effort of a lifetime. It provides appropriate means to achieve the desired goal. Not in the business-like way. Nowadays, I think in many ways society has taken over some of the language that we Christians have developed for many centuries. That vision sometimes of more, of engagement, of solidarity, things like that. And that's good in many ways. But in a way, it has left us without a language, without words to use to give ourselves a different vision and be able to achieve the goals that Christ wanted us to do. So those are some of the features of intercultural living. I want to give you 3 guidelines or frameworks in a way that can help you build that model, or a model that may work for you of intercultural living. And they're kind of simple in a way, but they have a lot of reflection that we can invite you into. First is that we are called to build a common home together, basically in this globalized world. And if you look at climate change, you can go from there as well. But it works where we have a place that we call our home. That is where no one is a stranger. And everyone can then bring something to the table. Religious people are called to leave the home of their birth. We know that, especially when you enter a community or when you move. In ministry, that's what you're doing for the sake of the gospel. So that should, in a way, be somewhat of a second nature to you. But in this home, people are called to be concerned about each other, not just about yourself. And we may do that in different ways. But the point here is that as we are in solidarity with one another, I'm not only concerned with you, but I also receive some type of concern from you. That mutuality aspect of the encounter has to be important. So this new home should nurture faith, should be a place of mutual support and encouragement and challenge. It should give people an idea of the kingdom of God, that people care for you, and you can get out of yourself to care for others as well, right? Sometimes we can call that emotional intelligence at times, but it's really a call of the kingdom of God. We're also called to discover the dignity of difference. I don't have a lot of time to dwell on this in a way, but it's about knowing and accepting and working with the idea that we are different. And I have to let you be as you let me be. Remember, humans tend to define things according to differences. We have a challenge to see differences positively and constructively. We're all the same, of course. The DNA tells us that, right? Yet we are all different. I don't know why humanity uses differences to disagree, to dissent, to discriminate. Those are kind of the basic things. And in different continents, you can see that being done in different ways. In the United States, we've come to see that big sin of discrimination as whiteness. It could be called something else, but given our own history, it's whiteness. Intercultural living also intends to rediscover the dignity or perhaps the value of difference. And the third point is that we are called to rethink the way we think. I think I've been telling you that kind of implicitly, because most people are trained to in dialectical, logical reasoning, in one-directional reasoning at times. Or positional or exclusive mode of thought, the either-or, is what most of us are used to. But other people, other cultures, and even within the same culture, people do analogical thinking, which looks for compromises between the two extremes. It's the both and thinking. We all know that as Catholics we always say, right? Both and. Not one or the other, but both and. Jesus is both human and divine. But the analogical, at least for intercultural living and ministry, is better placed where common living and unity in diversity are sought, where you want to live with that liminal, with that ambivalence at times, that ambiguity. That is either the way, either building up or tearing down is a false choice. I've used those pictures, for example, when we take people to the border. And from there to discern other things and reflect about other things. It's not either just a wall, and this is Mexico, that's the United States, or this is Canada, and that's the United States. All of that sometimes is the either or, and those are false choices. Especially as Catholics, what we are called to do is to discern and to kind of begin to see some clarity in that unfocused picture that we call life, especially our own life. So I'll give you 5 more minutes for dialogue at your tables and do further comments of what we looked at so far, especially in the second point of the features and the three suggestions for what do you find challenging, what is affirming, what are small steps that you can take to live and minister in an intercultural way. And let's begin to introduce that idea of who is the other to you at this point. For many of you in the parish is Spanish-speaking people. For others in another parish, it might be Vietnamese or any other Asian community or African community or any other kind of community. So, have fun for 5 minutes. Okay. Another nice round of discussions, lively discussions. It looks like it, which is great. Now I want to finish with 7 characteristics, eventually we'll talk. And the last points are, to me, are the culminating aspects, both from theology and from secular perspectives as well. So intercultural communities, what we can call radically inclusive communities, we can discern some characteristics. I'm noting 7, it could be more, but 7, as you know, in the Old Testament especially, it's important, so we want to be somewhat theological and biblical especially. But at the end of the day, living and ministerial practice, you know that is very diverse for different reasons and in different cultures, in different contexts, all of that. So the first characteristic is that intercultural living needs intentionality. You have to have a community or a common project to do this. And so some questions that you can pose yourself are, what are we living for? What is worth dying for or working for? You know, even at the School of Theology, why am I here? It's not just a job. It's a mission. It's something that gives you, a formator I had would say, it's something that makes you get up in the morning, that gives you a passion for coming and doing something. Another question is, how do we achieve our mission as a community or as an institution of diverse members? Not everyone is the same. How does our context shape our way of being? When you travel, you can see that as an outsider, right? Sometimes. When you're inside, you don't see it as much, but eventually you begin to see some things. And you begin to ask also, what are the blessings or the challenges brought about by our diversity? For some, it's a point of challenge. For some others, it's a strength. And all of that can be expressed, as we do so much in the parishes or even in our schools, in our institutions, It's expressed as a mission statement. MAC loves to empower, or the mission of MAC is to empower leaders for multicultural ministry in the church, whichever way that is going to be accomplished. So you empower, you bring people together from different cultural groups, from different backgrounds, to work together. But intercultural living also requires individual commitment. It's not just a nice mission statement, right? And a little bit of maybe two sentences of a vision. It requires that people buy into it. So the family, the community, the parish, or the parish project should be articulated clearly. What is it that we want to be? Where are we driving to? And every member then should be included. It requires the commitment of all. And everyone is asked to play a part for the good of the community. And as the Jesuits say, for God's glory. Every member is called to play a part. And everyone has something to do, to say, some type of influence to do. However, intercultural living also requires mutual tolerance. This is absolutely important, I think, that you take appropriate risks, but at the same time, you tolerate the other. It's not just about accepting sin. This is not the point in this particular conversation. It's about allowing people, giving the space to people to express themselves so you can get to know something else and they can get to also know something else. And so mistakes will be made, and that's just part of life. We will need some reference for that, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And so when people fail, they shouldn't be strongly sanctioned when it comes to interculturality, obviously. Again, we're not talking about sin, which could be a totally different thing. And the reason is because creativity should be encouraged. And you know that when we are creative, we can also make mistakes. That just happens almost every day. And so empathic correction is needed, especially from an elder, from someone with experience who can tell you what may have gone wrong or how you might want to do it differently next time. Also, in intercultural living, a forum for articulating frustration is needed. That is, somehow you have to find a way to let the steam off. And sometimes kind of even retreat from something, from that kind of living, to go back to yourself. I could tell you many stories about this. But we do that all the time almost. I remember being once in Brazil, and I speak a little bit of Portuguese, but I was tired and I was stressed because the meetings that I wanted to get weren't coming together. And the family that I was living with obviously speaks only Portuguese. And then a friend of mine, the priest who was from the family, called me, and I spoke to him in Spanish. And I said, I don't want to hear any more Portuguese. And that happens. So frustrations and misunderstandings happen in communities. Of course, not in parishes or schools, right? Let that happen. And it's kind of normal for the growing process to be. Children are like that. And that's why sometimes you send them to the corner. Wait a minute, time out. You go there. I know you're frustrated, you're not liking this, but we don't behave that way. So members should be allowed to voice that frustration that they might have, or the frustrations they might have. They shouldn't really feel prohibited or intimidated or accused when they do so. If the reason is that if members feel intimidated, they will not share their fears. What members so members should be valued and be encouraged to explore things. Because of that, there will be better, I think, bridge building among one another. More really heart-to-heart conversations. They will not necessarily have to be the come to Jesus conversation that we say, okay, I'm going to lay down the law. It's more about heart to heart. Let's see what is wrong and why you're going through that, or why am I going through that? And so appropriate correction may be needed at times. And again, as I said, appropriate correction should be done by the individuals or the leaders, those with more experience, the wisdom people that have been there with us or in the group. The correction also should not be used to humiliate someone. That sometimes happens in parishes, in religious congregations, and you end up ostracizing people. That's not what you want. You want to, again, give them the space, because vindictiveness of any kind is not justifiable. What is needed is attentive listening, dialogue. And so all correction should be intended to restore or to build, not to destroy or ostracize. The sixth point is attention to cultural stress and burnout must also be attended to. I told you a little bit about that, because we all tend to burn out, to be stressed out, to be frustrated. And so the misunderstandings resulting from language differences or bad will should also be addressed. We all have had those moments. We were just talking with one of the monks about how sometimes you don't risk when you're learning the language, right? Because you don't want to be misunderstood. But people laugh at you sometimes because they know you didn't mean that. You meant something else, and that's how you learn. So sensitivity is called for. So stress times, like the end of the academic semesters, the pandemics, assessment times, preparations for feast days, should always be monitored. And also then we should know that someone is going to act up, or act out. As long as it's not totally disruptive, usually that is part of being multicultural, especially being intercultural. And so at the end of the day, as we live all of those things, we have to seek clarification of the vision and always ask, is this the vision that God wants? Is this what we see? Or is what we see what God sees? What is God seeing? That seeing of the judging and the acting has to be there. So the community's vision has to be based on God's vision. That's the whole point of doing discernment. And the question is always, what is God asking? And how is the community responding? God's vision for the community doesn't change. But the community members need to change. We need to adjust and continue to seek God's will, because even though we might know what God's will is today, tomorrow that will need to be expressed in a different way. When you get married, that's how it is. And you plan to have 2 kids, right? And one of the pregnancies is triplets. God wanted you to have kids, but now you're going to live it in a different way. That's the point of this. So our structures and strategies should be aligned with our vision, the overall vision of God. And the overall vision of God, even in the Trinity, is giving yourself for the other, and the other giving themselves for you. So I want to finish with this. In Latin America, many theologians developed this preferential option for the poor, which eventually some of you, especially systematic and historians in theology, know eventually became part of the teaching, and then church teaching universal as well, and it's been well received. It has worked. It has its limitations, as almost every teaching has, but Father Anthony Higgins uses it to talk about this encounter in intercultural living, encountering the other, and opening yourself up to the fact that you are also the other, even to yourself. And we could go with St. Augustine and talk a little bit about that as well, right? But we're not in a patristic theology class where we can express all of that or study all of that. The point Father Anthony makes is that the other not only is someone else, but also in the context of an intercultural community and commitment to cross-cultural mission, the other is the person in your mirror, yourself. Every one of us becomes the stranger or the other, which means we have two roles: to act appropriately as the stranger, the not at home person, and he uses a technical term for that, not at home person, and most of us are not at home. We always have some type of doubt, right? Some type of discomfort. But also to treat others appropriately as strangers. In a way, let them be uncomfortable and ask them how you can make them comfortable. Father Anthony continues and says, if these two roles are properly understood and lived, there will, or should be, a progressive development of mutual relationships. We're both strangers. We're trying to get to know one another. We're strangers to ourselves, to God, and I'm also a stranger to you. As a result, everyone will be the stranger, but also incorporated, not assimilated, as a true and full member of the intercultural community, because they bring some aspects to the dialogue or some input into the dialogue. He also quotes other secular, non-religious authors, and as sometimes it happens, sometimes the non-religious authors actually tell it to you in a very religious way. They just don't know it at times. And you're like, that's very religious. So, two authors say this about intercultural living. In becoming intercultural, we rise above the hidden grips of culture and discover that there are many ways to be good, true, and beautiful. In this process, we acquire a greater capacity to overcome cultural parochialism and develop a wider circle of identification. No longer is my tribe my reference point. No longer is my family, in a way, my reference point. Whatever you call family, in a way, no longer is the group that gives me reference, that I feel gives me reference, is the only thing. And they say this, in a way, becoming intercultural is a process of liberating ourselves from limited perspective on life, or becoming more fully human, with a greater awareness of and sensitivity to self, others, and the relationship between them. The only thing missing them there in that quote is to self, others, and God, the very definition of spirituality. And this is what secular authors are saying. So I end with that, but I wanted to end also with this little video. I'll explain it to you after it runs, and then we can have a conversation if you wish. Who do you think those people are?
Ethiopian Orthodox. Yeah.
The Greek Catholic, Roman Catholic, the Latin Catholic. But who do you think the individuals are?
Priests.
They're the priests. We took this video in Colombia at an Afro-Latino Mass. And this was during communion. It wasn't like just the entrance song or something. This was in communion after all the priests, all of us had gone to communion, and people were going to communion. And so as the communion hymn, which was that lively song going on, those who were doing Afro-Latino ministry were singing and dancing. Of course, I couldn't do that. But I thought, this is amazing. If you really learn from the other and allow the other to teach you. To me, what they were teaching me was, yes, you can be a priest, and yes, you can dance. Yes, you can sing, and yes, you can be happy. To me, that's extremely important because it comes through the other. Somebody that I don't know, I don't share many common values, yes, but living, not much. But I could accompany them, and they could teach me something, and I could also teach them something. So my prayer for all of us is that we can learn something and teach something as well to the others as we begin to know one another, and at the end of the day, we can get to know God. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Father Juan, for that wonderful presentation. We have time for a couple of questions, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and I can come around with the mic. Don't go too far, Father Juan.
Hello again. I don't have a fully formed question, but I've been playing this idea around in my head, and I was wondering if you might be able to offer some insight. The difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation.
I couldn't give you a very clear definition, but the way that I have understood it sometimes is when you appropriate somebody else's culture, but in that appropriation there may be some mistakes. We, in a way, shouldn't be doing that. You should be appreciating what that culture has to offer. You can identify with it, but you're never going to be fully that of that other culture. As much as I am an immigrant, for example, I will never be or understand fully the African American experience. So I appreciate it. I will not ever own it. So to me, that's the difference: the appropriation that I can have, and the appreciation that I can have, even with my own Afro-Latino brothers and sisters, people of African descent whose families were slaves in Latin America and have come to the United States. They might for the most part, be able to appropriate that same experience of the African American, whereas I couldn't. Even here in the United States, I have realized that I am a descendant of colonizers in a way. So.
Thank you for your presentation. When thinking about the 7 points that you listed, I thought that's really our curriculum for intercultural living.
Sure.
And whether it's implicit or explicit or however we do it. I wondered, from your experience at Mock, is there something that's hard about this for the people at Mock and that we can learn from?
Mm-hmm. The most, not being Mexican American, I'm Salvadoran American, the most challenging thing I have seen is moving us from that bipolarity, us, them, Mexican Americans, and the rest of society, to truly being intercultural. And sometimes, as a leader, you may sound as if you are insisting on something or you want it your way, right? We used to talk about that at Catholic Relief Services as well. But the point is that you have to keep insisting on bringing us to the next stage, or in broadening our horizon in what you think is the vision of God. Let me give you a very clear example. Obviously, convocation, Mass of the Holy Spirit, graduation, all of those things are bilingual. That's just the rule. We're a bilingual school to begin with. And so once in a while, I've been asking to have a reading in Vietnamese, because that's our growing population. And to also get us into that idea that it's not just us Hispanics. It's really, we're preparing people to be in a multicultural church. And we need to be intercultural. So this last time, as we were preparing for convocation, the sister who does campus ministry with us couldn't find one of the Vietnamese students. So she basically said, okay, we're going to do it bilingually. And that came to our leadership team meeting, and I said, absolutely not. I didn't give an answer as to how to do it. I just said, I really would like us to move out of that model. Eventually, they found an Indian student who, when he was asked, would you do one of the readings in your language? I think it was Malayalam, something like that. When they asked him, he couldn't believe it. Because, sister says, when I asked him, he was like, you really want to hear it in my language? There is something about that otherness. You become familiar with the Vietnamese. They've been with us for many years. And we've had New Year masses and celebrations and all of this. And so you already begin to have a sense for the sound of Vietnamese. But listening to Malayalam, it's a different thing. So I think we always have to have that attitude of, how am I going to get to appreciate other aspects of that other? Hope that helps.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate what you said about us not just acquiring skills and techniques, but having like the right attitude and disposition. And so I'm wondering, how do you foster that attitude and disposition, particularly like in theological academy or the academic spaces?
Mm-hmm. Readings can do that a lot. At MAC, the way that we do it, because we are bicultural, right? At least to begin with, your curriculum has to have something about the other. And when we do Christology, for example, there has to be a different kind of reading about Christology. So that's one way. I won't go into that because I could spend another 15 minutes talking about titles of books and all of that and authors. The other one is what you did this morning in Convivium, where there is a shared sense that we're all in this together. And you read the Our Father in two languages at least. So that begins to build that sense that this is common to me, not to know everything. Because at the end of the day, in life, I don't know everything. So those attitudes have to be fostered and nourished. You begin with what you can, and let that continue to be. Mm-hmm.
We have time for one more. The others?
Wow.
Wow.
You're either too nice or don't want to challenge me.
I'll ask one, Father Bob. My experience, and probably out of a deep place of privilege, is that the Intercultural Church has been a place of welcome and joy for me everywhere I go internationally. It gives me a real deep sense of my identity and my belonging. I know that's not been true for all my sisters and brothers in the church. But I find that the bridge that I have a hard time crossing is those who do not share the faith with me. And immediately inside of me, I feel almost empowered to build a wall of those who, and I share the faith. I know people who don't identify as practicing Christians, And I'm wondering what you might say to someone like me who needs to work on that. How do I see value in that kind of intercultural encounter, where I'm sort of most nervous or most brittle?
Yeah. Again, not a how-to, but more perhaps a learning that I've seen. When I was working with Catholic Relief Services, we used to do a lot of trips, and especially to Africa or Asia. We could learn from our brothers and sisters in Africa and Asia about interreligious dialogue. not just ecumenical. And I think that is the learning that we Westerners, especially white Westerners, have to do, or privileged Westerners, where you no longer need to think that Christianity is the model, the only model, but rather that Nostra Aetate has it, right? When we do ecclesiology or anywhere else where we see those documents of Vatican Council II, or the Second Vatican Council, they begin to tell us that the truth in God, the divinity, is also in other religions. Somehow, we need to recognize something out of that. And if we begin to at least feel, I think, that ease or recognize that discomfort and name it, but allow the other to be, that may be helpful. Yeah. Oh, we all have it, I think. I visited Saudi Arabia, for example. And so you feel that at times. When you get out of your own culture, Western culture, right? And you're the only one who dresses differently, all of that, you begin to see how uncomfortable that can be, but at the same time, that's how they live. So I need to get a little bit more comfortable with that. I could tell you a joke about this as well, but we can leave that for just a more informal conversation.
Well, thank you again for being a part of tonight. Can we give Father Juan another round of applause?
Thank you.
We are grateful for your presence in our community and look forward to many more opportunities together with Mock. Just a note that this presentation will be on the Digital Commons next week, so you will be able to access it again and the PowerPoint as well for notes. So thank you for coming. I really appreciate events and the beautiful hospitality that they provided, as well as our IT services and media that recorded this and live streamed it for us. So thank you to all of our online community as well. Blessings on your evening, and have a good night.